get going. The title of this talk is, "So You Want to Be an Open Source Hero? Turn Your app or library into a thriving open source project." First, a little about me. My name is Andrew Embler. I'm CTO and co-founder of PortlandLabs. And a little about PortlandLabs. We maintain a lot of open source code, and our flagship product is Concrete Files, which many of you probably know, that table in particular. This is our 10th year of being an open source product, and I'd like to take this time to share some things that I've learned along the way as we took this from a project that no one used to a project used by hundreds of thousands of people, all of which came about by luck, coincidence, and happenstance along the way. Before we learn how to run an open source project, I want to talk a little bit about why you even want to in the first place. Obviously, everyone in this room has experience with open source, and whether you know it or not, which you probably do, but you might not have thought about some of its specific benefits. Open source is interesting because there are kind of asymmetric benefits to the developers and the users of the software. So they're different. To the users and the customers, probably the most obvious one is that open source is typically free. When you're learning something, you might be younger, you're cash strapped, you don't have a lot of money to shell out for even a subscription to Photoshop or something along the way. An open source product that is free is really helpful in that regard. For the technically inclined, open source is malleable for developers, which is great. You can actually get in there, make changes. You're not locked into the way that the software works out of the box. For the security conscious amongst us, which should be all of you, open source is more secure, which you probably all understand. A lot of people don't understand why that might be the case. How can something where you have access to all the source code and all of its flaws be more secure? And that's precisely because you have more people looking, and you can poke out all of the weird little problem spots. And finally, open software is viable in the long term. So you know that with software as a service, or even closed source software, if the software goes away, you're stuck on that last version if it's closed source, or if it's software as a service, it could go away tomorrow, and you're basically you're locked out. With open source, you know that as long as you have that, you can continue to maintain your copy of it, and it will keep going for the long term. Benefits to the developers, like us, you get an active community on day one. So you have more people using your software, more people reporting the problems about it, more people reporting what they like about it. You have this collaborative environment right from the get-go. In theory, you have more doers, more people than just on your payroll or just yourself are able to commit changes to your code, help you improve it, add new features, fix bugs, etc. Security is obviously a benefit to a developer as well. We have a pretty active presence on HackerOne, and if you're not familiar with HackerOne, it is an online service where people just kind of try and break your software and see what they can do to it. And as a developer, I actually find that comforting because I know that they're going to find the issues before black hat hackers do in the wild, and it's going to be better for us in the long term to have more people poking and prodding at our software. And finally, on day one, you get a wide audience. You get people all around the world who want to use your software if it's open source. So I'm about done with the talk. I think we all learned a lot today. Unfortunately, it's not enough to just put your source code up on GitHub and just have it out there. There's a lot of code on GitHub if you haven't checked it out. Open source is not really like this, even though you kind of wish it would be. It could be. When you put your open source code up on GitHub, you're kind of you basically created a situation where you're asking people to find a needle in a stack of needles. So I'm going to give you some thoughts about how we managed to rise above that initial sort of obscurity. First, you're going to want to get noticed. Then you're going to need to take your software forward. And as you do that, you're going to build a community, and you need to embrace them. And then finally, you're going to have to give up some of your control, which is probably counterintuitive and may not be something that you want to do, but it will be good for your software in the long run. So first, let's talk a little bit about how we might go from 1 user to 1,000. There are some things that we can do. There's 6 of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in order. These are the types of things. First, it's pretty obvious, but in case you don't, if you want to run an open source project, put it up on open source project hosting, someplace like GitHub or GitLab. If you don't want to be locked into software as a service, you can get Fabricator and host it yourself. You need to put that software somewhere where people can find it and learn about it and download it. And most importantly, contribute back to it. I don't want to tell you which one to choose. It doesn't matter. It just has to be somewhere. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. When we started using Concrete 5, or when we started Concrete 5, we actually used SourceForge because it was the dominant one at the time, which certainly dates us, but it is what it is. And just a little anecdote about just why you want to put your software out there publicly. We hosted our own version control, which was Subversion, and we had our own bug tracker, so we really didn't need SourceForge for anything. We could have put the zip up on our own site, which we did. And but we thought, we need to have this on SourceForge because this is the dominant platform. Well, in 2008, we had a booth at OSCON, and someone who worked for us at the time bumped into someone who worked at SourceForge, and they took them back to the booth and gave them a demo of the software, and they were really impressed. And then we were lucky enough to be made Project of the Month on SourceForge in October of 2008. And I remember the month because it was such a big deal for us at the time, and it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been embracing some kind of open source, open platform for project hosting. And that was one of the big milestones in the early days for us. In fact, there are probably some people who are, if not in this room, at this conference because they heard about us and downloaded us on SourceForge during that big push. So I can't stress enough, put your software on a public platform. Next, if you're a web library or even a desktop app or a server app, you need to make sure that your software is in a package manager. Obviously, this is pretty much a no-brainer, but in case you're late to the party, package manager makes it easy for users who are making projects to download the dependencies of those projects. It actually took Concrete 5 quite a while to be viable in a package manager just due to the way that we're structured as a platform. But I'm really glad that some members of the team were able to push through that and make that happen because it's just, it's a game changer. People will find your stuff. It makes it a lot more seamless to work in the modern state of web development. So if you're a PHP library, embrace Composer, JavaScript, NPM, web content with Bower, or even using apt if you're a server library, or open source product, be in Homebrew for the Mac users out there. Package managers are essential for modern web application development, and you should be in them. Next, write some documentation. This is obviously our strongest suit, I know from talking to people at the conference. But you need to do it. We've been doing a bit of hiring at PortlandLabs lately, and talking with potential developers with us. We asked them, how do you know when to choose a dependency to add to a project? And invariably they say the number one metric is whether that library is well documented. So this is serious and it's important. More docs isn't always better. I've used some platforms that have kind of an exhaustive amount of docs in wiki format, but the sheer amount of them and the sort of unfocused nature of how they're presented, it's not perfect to have that many docs. So more is not always better, which is great, because in the beginning you might find it overwhelming to think, I need to make all these docs. Like, no, just start small. A README is better than nothing. And then you can also start with practical examples. I find that if I'm looking at a library on GitHub to include in Concrete 5 or for whatever purpose, if it has an examples folder and I can just kind of dig in there and see how it works, that is oftentimes totally enough. You don't need to write these long docs with the introduction and the preamble and the conclusion, and that's a lot more work than you might need to do when you're first starting out. Just put the practical examples out there so that your users don't have to suss all that out for themselves. Next, keep it up to date. This is really tough, but you gotta try to keep it up to date. And finally, something is always better than nothing. Next, make some videos. I don't learn through videos, but when talking with potential developers, asking them, how do you keep your skills up to date? YouTube is the #1 answer, which it's really interesting to me. Yeah, make videos of your product. You may or may not remember this. I had to hunt this down on the web, but this is the original video of how to build a blog on Rails that I think popularized, at least to me, the term screencast. I'd never heard it before. This was 2005, I think. I'd never heard the term screencast before, and then this thing came out. And it's pretty simple, just shows this sort of scaffolding approach, but I think it was responsible for a huge amount of growth within the early days of the Rails community. Videos are an essential way to get people to notice your library. Obviously, they're going to work better if your library has a visual component to it, but even if it doesn't, putting together some videos of people using the command line on your stuff is better than it not existing. Next, write some blogs and articles. These are different than docs. You can focus less on the sort of technical details and the dry, here's how to install the thing, and here's how to do these simple operations, and more on solutions and take a friendlier tone. Blogs and articles, they will give people a reason to choose your software, which is different than the documenting of how your software works. And one thing you can do when you're working with your new library is you can write articles that promote how your library works as an alternative to maybe what's popular out there. And finally, blogs and articles, they last forever, and they may, it's work, it's not fun, but unless you love to write, but they last forever. I have some articles on the Zen framework that I wrote in an afternoon, and that they get more traffic than anything else. So yeah, definitely consider doing that. Next, and it pains me to say this, but you need to embrace social media and forums. If you have strong how-to articles and blog posts, you can publicize those, which I think is more effective than just publicizing your software in a vacuum. You can actually link to the articles themselves and let people know why they should look at your library. When your software is new, you're asking users to trust you, and it's going to be easier for them to do that if they can put a face and a name to that software than just a library in a vacuum. You don't have to be on every social network. It's probably not necessary to start an Instagram account on day one for your library, although we do have a Concrete 5 Instagram account. A presence on Reddit and Stack Overflow is probably essential. These days, a public Slack. We have tons of traffic in our public Slack to the point where it's a harrowing place to be. People love it. It's very active. I would heartily encourage you to start with public Slack. And finally, get a forum going. You don't have to build it from scratch like we did. You can Discourse or PHPBB or anything. You need or Reddit. You need a place where people can ask questions, and the most important thing is you can respond to every forum post immediately. This is what we did day one. We were just so happy that people were using our software that we were on every forum post. It is not like that now, but it used to be, and it's the way that you should start. There are some not so good ways to get noticed. You can talk trash about other competitors in your field. That's not great. It might be kind of effective or cathartic to you, but if you're competing with other open source communities, these communities are passionate people who like their software and the software they've chosen as much as you like yours. And you might peel some people away from those, but it's more likely that you're just going to alienate the members of these other communities, and that's not great. Lavish spending, don't take out a billboard about your open source project. You don't need to do that. That time and money is better spent responding to forum posts. And finally, concept videos. I don't find that these are that useful. This is different than kind of putting a video out there talking about your what you actually do, but an actual concept video about some glitzy thing that you want to eventually do. Just either do the thing or get to work. There are some exceptions to this. Sad to say, Concrete 5 kind of broke the first rule on this. I think in our early days, I remember us taking some digs at WordPress, and I'm not super proud of that. I don't remember what we said, and I'm sure we thought it was hilarious at the time.
Where are they today?
Yeah, I know. Mission accomplished. And then also, with regards to concept videos, there was a blogging platform called Ghost that was on Kickstarter, and I think they raised like £300,000 or something like that. So I may not always know what I'm talking about, but I think, those are definitely the exceptions to the rule, and I think they're also just distractions from what you should be doing on a day-to-day basis. So if you do these things, you will start to grow a community of people who are using your stuff. Hopefully it might be a few hundred people, it might be 1,000, but you will have people now, and now you get to deal with people. So what you need to do now is evolve your software now that you've got some people using it. You've taken the necessary steps to move your software from a private library or utility that can be used by a larger group of people. And this is what you've basically done, even though you don't know it, is created an ecosystem around your software. So now what you need to do is go back to the software and improve it and evolve it so that you can keep that sort of virtuous circle going. We're going to do that by making a roadmap, getting help, keeping that software quality high. You've got more people working on it, continuing to document the thing, and just keeping that cycle going. So first, make a roadmap. Listen to your early adopters. These are the people that have just come on. They're invaluable when it comes to determining how your software is going to go. That doesn't mean you do everything that everyone says. Listen doesn't mean do everything that everyone says. It just means take in their feedback, and there's probably truth to it, even if you're sort of going to figure out how to implement that truth. And yeah, don't do everything everyone says. You've got to maintain your vision. Your software is being used by these people because they want to use it. So obviously there's some value in the vision that you have already brought to bear. You have to keep that and be strong in that. Don't stop using your product. Presumably you made it to scratch an itch in the first place. Don't use a competitor and if you do, it's time to move on. You need to be as passionate about your product today as you were in the beginning, and that's eating your own dog food. And finally, you're on this open source project hosting. You need to make sure that you use an issue tracker to keep this roadmap public and so that people know where you're going. Don't just keep it in a black box. This has been something that we haven't always done this. It's kind of fun to go dark and emerge like a beautiful butterfly with features, but in the early days, it's better to be public about how that works. Next, accept help. Pull requests are your friend. It's funny, in our early days when we were hosted on Subversion, we didn't go to GitHub until maybe 2010, 2011, And so before that, I think we had accepted a total of like 3 code submissions that were in the form of just diffs. And they just came in and you applied it to the code and committed it, and there you go. And now to look back on that after the volume of pull requests that we get on GitHub is insane. Like we routinely get more code from the community than we actually put in the core ourselves. GitHub and modern Git issue trackers are invaluable for that. Don't turn away good code if people want to help you write it. In order to get that help, label issues that you want help on. Seems obvious, but there are lots of times when I go to GitHub issue trackers and there's just this sort of unfiltered list of issues with no precedence, no tag of help wanted. Put out a help wanted tag and put that on your issues that you want help with. Similarly, people want to help, but open source is intimidating, and people won't necessarily open pull requests blind if they think they might get yelled at or they might get shot down. So you have to give people permission to help you and ask repeatedly, please contribute back. It might seem obvious to you, but it's not obvious. So tell people how they can help, tell them what you're expecting, and give them permission. As you do this and you start to take in code from other people, it's going to be tough to maintain the code quality. You've got multiple people cooking in the kitchen now, and so the dish could get a little funky. High speed, as you develop and ship code, means more mistakes. And you, much like a band with their first album that they labored over for 10 years and the second one comes out and it's kind of weird, you had a lot of time to do that first release and you put it out there, and now you're everyone can see you making those changes in real time, and that could lead to more mistakes. Similarly, more developers leads to more mistakes and inconsistency. So definitely embrace code standards. We didn't do that. We had informal standards for a long time, but it wasn't until I think our 7th major release that we kind of adopted actual PSR code consistency, and that should have been done a long time ago. It's a really good idea. I urge you to consider some kind of coding standards for your community and make those public. Next, from the get-go, please embrace unit testing from the start. We did not, and it's too bad that we did not. I'm definitely a realist and a pragmatic person about deadlines and in unit testing, and so I would never say that 100% of your code needs to be unit tested, or that you need to embrace even test-driven development. But I will tell you that for some of our new features, we do a lot of unit testing as we write sort of the core of these new features. And I recently had the opportunity to change how some core functionality worked in a pretty fundamental way. But there was actually, amazingly enough, a suite of tests that covered what I was changing, and it made all the difference in the world. So, and it's 100 times easier if you start from a place of unit testing than if you try to add that after the fact. So definitely start with it. And finally, if you use a platform like Travis for continuous integration, you'll be able to run these style tests and unit tests every time someone commits. And that will make your life easier because you'll know that their code is passing your tests. As you change your code, don't forget about your docs. You need to keep the screenshots up to date. It's a small thing, but we are super lucky to have community members who do that for us, because we're not always great about doing everything that I've got in these slides. I'm just telling you the ideal world that you could try to live in. But we're fortunate enough to have open source members of our community who help keep our screenshots up to date, and it's a small thing, but it's very valuable. As you do your docs, if you try to do your docs while developing these new features, the time that you take now to do it will save you 10 times as much time later, because just the work that you're doing is fresh in your mind. You can do it at the end of the day after you've done something. It's going to be a lot easier than coming back to it cold 6 months later after people are like, you released this feature and now there's no docs about it. Or 3 years later after you've released a feature and there are no docs about it. So, and finally, embrace a platform for user-contributed documentation. We've actually used a Concrete 5 instance for this, which makes sense because we're a CMS. But if you're developing a library, you can use GitHub for your docs and accept pull requests on your docs as well. Anything that enables other people to contribute to your docs, because people in open source communities, they don't always feel comfortable touching code or making pull requests. But a lot of people want to write and know how to write, and they want to help others learn. And so give them a way to improve your docs. Finally, release early and release often. I think this is probably the most important in the early days because nothing is set in stone, and it's only going to get harder and harder to do releases. If you look at the velocity of our releases over time, they just get slower and slower because as you change things and your software becomes more complex, it just there's many more moving parts and things to break. And early on, you don't have that problem, and it's wonderful. So your software is new, you can take advantage of that. Every release that you do will drive traffic to your software, which is great. It will get people reevaluating it. You can write new blogs about the updates that you're doing. It also validates the work of people who are working with you. Definitely, as you do release notes, put their names in there. I think this is something we do a pretty good job of, and hopefully it gets people excited about having their code contributed to the core. And finally, put the release in the release tools that are in your platform. So GitHub has a releases feature that I think they added, I don't know when they added it, but it hasn't always been there. Or Git tags just in Composer. Don't make people just link against the master branch of your Composer project. Actually do releases and document what are in those releases, and people will appreciate that. And next, you just want to keep doing that over and over as much as possible. And it's going to get harder and harder to maintain. After a while, your software is going to be sufficiently complex that following the cycle just takes a while. But hopefully at this point, you have a community that's big enough that they can kind of help you push through that those difficult parts. So next, what we need to do is we have to embrace our community. You're going to find that now it's a lot bigger than when it started. I mean, when it started, it was one, but even when when you push through your first few months, your community is going to be of a sufficient size. And you'll probably start to get an informal picture of what that community looks like. You're going to see the same names popping up here and there. You see the same GitHub avatars. You may not write everyone down, but you're going to start to notice the same your community leaders. And once you start doing that, it's probably a good time to get some more structured help from those people. So this is probably not too unlike the last talk that was in this room. We're going to meet some of the members of our community. Whether it's people submitting pull requests or talking in the forums, you're going to get that picture of the community, and you're going to meet some positive members of your community, and that is going to be great. So let's start with what I'm calling the workhorse, and this is probably hopefully the most common of your community members. This is a person who just produces good bug reports, helps with your issues, and whether you have to ask or not. And I think one of the underlooked aspects of this is a person with whom you can kind of communicate in general terms, and when they do things for you, they work the same way that you do, which is not to be discounted, because communication, this entire thing is built on communication, and it's tough. You're dealing with people who speak different languages and work in different time zones and are different ages, and it's a very you're dealing with it's a wide world out there. So if you can find someone with whom you communicate on the same wavelength, that's a big help. And and they stay in contact, which is another important thing. Next, not to be overlooked, is someone who uses your software and actually lets you know and is positive about it. And this, it doesn't happen as often as it should. I'm gonna take a little aside, and I don't mean me, I don't care about me, I'm just saying in general. If you depend on someone's open source work, you might consider letting them know, I'm not good about this. We could all be better about it. I'm just telling you, if you tell them, hey, that works really nice, you will have made a friend for life. It will make their day 100% better. It's those unsolicited thank yous that keep you going. This next one is one of my favorites. I call it the stranger. There are times in GitHub when a person comes in and they have a detailed bug report that's usually super specific, and it comes with a pull request that fixes the bug, and then you never hear from this person again, and you're wondering, who is this person? What are they doing? Why have I never heard from them? And it's clearly someone who uses your software in a business capacity, and they may not be a member of open source communities, but they utilize open source software in their daily lives, and they have seen fit to bless you with their expertise, which is awesome. So be thankful when they do. And then they are in and out without a sound. The spouse. This is a long-time user, and you can actually have more than one of them in an open source project, that's pretty great. I'm calling this person the spouse because the relationship is long-term, and this is a person with whom you may not see eye to eye on everything. There's usually some heated debates, but when push comes to shove, this is a person who will do anything for you, and they are going to take on tough jobs, usually thankless jobs, and they do this for you, and they will do more for you than almost anyone else. And finally, of the positive archetypes, I have the hero. We've got a whole table of heroes over there and over here and there. It's limited to a handful of people in your community, and they're with you through thick and thin, and they do whatever needs doing. These are people who will fly halfway across the world to watch you give a talk that you have barely practiced. These are also the people you need to look for when it comes time to give up some control of your project. And that's it. That's, every community is just full of these perfect people, and everything is great. This guy's my hero. So it's not just perfect. Unfortunately, open source communities aren't just made up of the positive contributors. You're going to run into some negative ones too. And here are some of the negative types of community members. The vampire, a sucker of time and attention. I've probably been this too. This is not someone who's necessarily overtly negative. It's just someone whose requests can kind of drain you after a while. This is not necessarily someone who, this is usually someone who is passionately involved in the community. They just need to maybe take a step back and can derail otherwise productive threads and conversations. Sometimes people can invade with negativity, and not that everything needs to be positive all the time, but if there's nothing constructive about an argument, it becomes difficult to work with someone who's not bringing that to the table. You're going to be making lots and lots of decisions as you worry about this library, and you're going to make mistakes, and you definitely want to own up to those mistakes and fix them, but it doesn't, when you know that you've made a mistake, it doesn't necessarily help to have someone constantly pointing that out. Then there's the grouch. This is also someone that I have been from time to time. This is a little different than the pessimistic person. And this one is interesting, I think, because the grouch isn't a sad person. The grouch is pissed off. And it's important to note that no one would come to an open source project just to be mad at the open source project. Maybe they do. The grouch is usually a former satisfied user who, for whatever reason, is not satisfied anymore. And it might do you well to figure out why. Maybe the project has changed focus. or focuses on things that this person doesn't find useful anymore. And it's important to remember that this person is angry out of insecurity or fear. And if the project is leaving this person behind, that would make me angry. And you want to, it's easy to dismiss because the person is hard to talk to, but it's good to, it would behoove you to figure out why they're so angry some of the time. So they don't come to Threads just to yell at you and make your life miserable, but some people do. I didn't want to use this image, I hate it, but I had to. We have been lucky enough to not to have too many overt trolls. I don't mean like spammers, we have tons of those, but like people who seem to come in to really make your life miserable just for the heck of it. You might get that, and I would urge you not to overthink what they're saying. If you can if you figure out that this person doesn't really have anything constructive to say, it's probably best to focus on the people who do. There might be logic behind what the person is doing, but there are not enough hours in the day to concern yourself with it. So these are some of the negative types, and you will get negative types. It's important, don't get hung up on those. You want to understand where some of this is coming from. It's not good to just bury your head in the sand, but don't beat yourself up on it. Next, to deal with some of this negativity, always try to clearly communicate your decisions. There have been definite times due to just development or life or stress where we have sort of dropped off the radar in our community, and that it never goes well when you do that. You want to be in contact with these people, because if you don't, you're going to get, the vacuum will be filled by something. And it's best if you keep that communication coming from you as much as possible. If there are negative threads in your community forums, try to shut them down. Don't just close them without a reason. That's not great. People don't like that. But if it's clear that something is not a productive discussion, you can say so and close them down. Much like that grouch archetype I talked about earlier, positive and negative roles can shift over time. We've had the good fortune of turning people around. People who are frustrated, they can become your biggest advocates if you can meet them and change their minds. It's not easy, but it does happen. If you are dealing with persistent negativity in your community, you can consider a code of conduct. Definitely some of the larger PHP communities have done this, and with good results. We haven't had to have one that's actually codified, but it's definitely something to consider if you're finding people are being harassed. And you don't want that, because you don't want a bad apple to spoil the bunch. In general, when you're dealing with your community, it's best to respond in discovery mode, not defensive mode. This is something that everyone can always be better at. I could definitely be better at that from time to time. It's amazing how different an issue or a GitHub request or any particular community feedback from someone feels when you're stressed out, on the run, kind of under the gun, versus when you're sort of refreshed and ready to take it in. So, if you're finding yourself stressed out and annoyed, maybe it's best to keep that email client closed. They're not going anywhere. Those issues will be around forever. You can wait until it's time to actually act on them in a positive way. Practice impulse control. I kind of wanted to show that Linus Torvalds image here where he's flipping off the camera, because that guy has some legendary outbursts. We all do, but just try to keep a level head. If you're going to write a response to something and it's a little bit vitriolic, maybe close it, send it tomorrow. It's important that negative feedback and negativity and the negative form types are different. There's value in negative feedback. If people are telling you something that is rubbing you the wrong way, it's probably, if one person says it, there's probably 100 who are thinking it, and it would behoove you to figure out what they're talking about. It's also important to remember that open source is multicultural, and communication styles are very different across the world. It's wonderful being in the same room with people that we've only talked to online, because we think that we're really good at communicating over email and on forums, and we're definitely, that's what we do on a daily basis. But even though we do it all the time, there's something much different about having those conversations in the flesh. And you can read body language, and things just come off completely differently than they do just even in Slack, which is a real-time communication. So just kind of remember that people communicate differently, and if someone is coming across to you as upset with you, they may not be. They may just have a different way of typing in Slack than you're used to. And finally, remember that you're dealing with a real, living, breathing human when you're talking to people. These are not just avatars behind the screen. And finally, you're going to find yourself dealing with this on a daily basis way more than you are actually going to be shipping code. And that's because you are now a politician, whether you like it or not. And that's a sign that your project has a life of its own, which is great. But now that it does, it's time to give up some of that control of your project. And first, why would you want to do that? Well, there's not enough hours in the day to both develop your project and, actually keep all of your people happy. Everything takes longer now that your software is of a sufficient size, and you're also pleasing your community. There are lots more systems to worry about, whether it's documentation or systems in your software. And making changes to a larger project takes a lot more time, and you still have to release code. You can't do everything that you need to do and develop the project full time. And it is continuous development that keeps projects alive. So we have to look for what to give up control on. First, it's probably good to look for places that are easy wins. So these are places where you don't have expertise and you don't want to own them. So a good example of this is Concrete 5 internationalization. We added localization to Concrete 5 early on, and we patted ourselves on the back and said, hey, now you can run Concrete 5 in multiple languages, and there you go, it's perfect. But it wasn't perfect because we don't speak multiple languages. So we didn't know what we were doing. And while we had it maybe 70% of the way, we didn't have plurals working right, we didn't have the expertise needed that we needed. And we also didn't feel strongly that we needed to own that particular problem. So thankfully we were able to outsource much of it to our beloved community members who have taken it much further than we could ever take it. You can also find places that are not impacted by turnover or slower process. So you want to keep the code velocity up, but there are certain things that if they can run at their own pace, give up control on those. We are fortunate to have community members managing our marketplace add-on process for us, to the point where we rarely even need to check in on it anymore, and we are so lucky for that. Find places, and that process can run slower, and it can run in a different way than actually shipping code. So give up control of that. Next, look for places that fit well in your community. So when we did a major non-backward compatible release, we still had to maintain the old copy, even though we were on to the next thing. We didn't really want to keep this thing around or devote resources to it. But we had a community member who was still actively using the older version and graciously agreed to take on management of that for us. And it was a natural fit because he still wanted to keep that software running. And so we were only too happy to let him do that. Next, you're going to look for who is going to help you run these particular processes. And you can look for your community leaders, which you've probably already identified. You're going to also want to continually evaluate for new talent in these jobs. And this is important because you're going to get turnover in these jobs because they are jobs. This is actual work that people are doing all the time, in addition to the work that they do to keep a house and keep their family fed. So it is a job, and don't take it personally when people, recede a little bit into the background. Their life circumstances may have changed. So just always, don't rely on someone always being there, even though you may luck into having some longtime community members. And finally, I think the hardest one is how do you give up some of that control? It's clear, at this point, it's probably clear what you want to get rid of. It's clear who you want to try and take on some of that. And maybe it's development. Maybe you love working with people and you're not that interested in actually maintaining the day-to-day code anymore. It's pretty clear what you want to get rid of, but how do you do it? I would urge you, we're still figuring that out, to be honest. I don't have any great answers to that other than try to use what tools are there already. This all comes down to work, and a lot of times it's easy for us to want some kind of new system to make things work in a mythically better way, more efficient even. We have no shortage of communication tools at our disposal, and shared spreadsheets and collaborative documentation and collaborative documents and word processing. Use the tools that exist out there and just get to work, whether it's a mailing list or a Google Doc or a Google Sheet. We are not lacking for ways to figure out what to work on. So it might be time to just roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. Don't make some Byzantine committee structure from the get-go. You might get there, and we might get there someday, and that works really well, but you may not need that, and don't stay up all night figuring that out right from the get-go. And finally, look at other successful communities for inspiration. All open source projects are kind of in the same boat, and a lot of times other communities will be only too happy to lend their expertise. And finally, when? You got to do it yesterday, as quickly as possible. And I think that is about enough. That is about it for me. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, thank you.
The example you gave for the interim, hard to say word, multi-language.
Yeah.
Did you have like a plan B in case nobody in the community was able to help you or something? Like, what would you advise in that kind of situation?
No, we did not, and it kind of happened organically. What basically happened was we launched it and we thought it was good, and we continued with that for a while, and then we had community members who were telling us that it was falling short, and it happened. We got pull requests that fixed it, and we would. For a long time, we kind of looked at the pull requests, and if we didn't understand everything 100%, we would say, no, this isn't going to work. And we learned that for a lot of that translation stuff in particular, we had to go, we had community members submitting this, and we went with them more on faith than we're used to, because they had experience with this problem that we did not. And so it really did happen organically. So it wasn't really like we went out to the community and said, we need someone to run this. And hopefully someone says yes. It really happened, it happened gradually as it became clear that we knew less about this than we thought, and other people knew more, and we should work together to figure out how that would work. And it happened over years. So we got pull requests that addressed a lot of that stuff, and then we hosted the translation files through other cloud services, and that worked okay. And then now we have a really nice sort of end-to-end translation stuff, but that is over the course of 5-6 years that happened. Alan.
If you could do one thing differently from your first year, what would it be? Just one.
Great question. I would unit test from the beginning. And that would make, or I would know more about how best to structure unit tests. I think I didn't quite understand, or I mean, it's a process. I'll get really specific. We have a ton of tests that actually make the database tables, and I didn't get mock objects or any of that stuff at the beginning, and just thinking well, you have to install this. No, you actually don't. And having more of an understanding of that is definitely something I would do. Franz.
Do you
speak more about the importance of strangers and kind of some of the just different perspective that you get from someone from a corporate environment that's choosing to take the risk to like submit code that their employer perhaps paid them to make?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a good reminder that that your software exists in a larger ecosystem than you could even imagine. And this happens when we do trainings too. We have people calling us up saying, we need to have this training, and you frequently meet extremely credible developers. Some of the smartest developers I've ever met are people who would never be in an open source community, to their detriment, obviously. It's a good place to be, but it's a good reminder that there are people of high skill levels using your stuff that you may not ever come in contact with. And so when you do get that, it's fun to try and get those people to stick around in an open source community, and I think that we have to a certain degree. But when you do find those new faces who are obviously engaging with your software a lot and only worried about this narrow thing, try and keep them in your community. Try and reach out to them again and say, hey, how do you use this software? I noticed that this is a really credible fix that you submitted, but I haven't seen you around these parts. Mike.
So the points you gave were focused more on sort of positively moving the project forward, advancing it. Are there any sort of like absolute pitfalls that you should, if you fell into them, would spell out that null for everything?
I'm sure that I'm sure that there probably are. I definitely, it's funny because we do this, we know that we should not, but we do. Keep the lines of communication open. Anytime that we get so focused on the work that we're doing around the core and the client work and stuff, and we don't devote time to the core or even just being present in the forums or in Slack or whatever, that something fills that vacuum. And so the worst thing you can do is to just kind of go dark for a period of time. And because it sort of leads to all sorts of other stuff, like it lets the negative, because people wonder, what are they doing? And your mind obviously goes to kind of the darker places, like they don't care about the software anymore, they don't care about this, and just be present. I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I've got two questions actually. First one is, what do you think of upvotes and downvotes on GitHub? The second one is, once you have your own project aligned and it becomes popular, you have less and less time to respond to individual questions from certain people. And sometimes you ignore people, whereas that's not intended.
Yeah.
That might be perceived as, hey, I'm being ignored. So how do you handle that?
It's interesting. I think upvotes and downvotes on GitHub are awesome. It's funny. This is just a microcosm of the sort of communication aspect. There was a pull request, and I think you may have submitted it, where because I remember having this back and forth on Slack, where I think you submitted a pull request, and I downvoted it, not out of some kind of just saying, like, I don't think this is what we want to do. And you got in touch with me and said, I don't know that that's, I don't know that people appreciate that. And you're totally right. Like the way that it was perceived, it wasn't meant as a indictment of the person specifically, but it totally comes across that way. So I think in our own community, in GitHub, you definitely see sort of the little like celebration emoticons and the upvotes and stuff, and you don't see a ton of the downvotes. And I think that's probably the way to go, because we definitely take those into account. I know if I go into a pull request and I see like 5 of those little thumbs up, like people want that, and it does matter, and it does impact what we accept and how fast we accept it. And then to speak to your second point, I actually I'm terrible about, we don't really go in the forums as much anymore, just because we're so busy, and we do have so many excellent community members who do that instead of us. But every GitHub issue and pull request actually goes into my inbox, and I have a personal policy. that it doesn't leave the inbox until I've either approved it, denied it, or someone is actively, or I've responded to it. Because for years I wasn't very good at that, and we kind of let pull requests come, and then we devote some time to it, and then here and there, and people are taking their time, whether you're going to accept it or not. People have already done a lot of work and put it on the line for you, and you should give them the courtesy of at least they're owed some kind of response for sure.
That's a question, potentially a second one. Was there ever anything that you, the members of the core team, fundamentally disagreed on for Concrete 5?
Not a single thing. No, I'm just kidding. It's funny. I think there have been, not so much lately, but around the 5.6 to 5.7 transition, Concrete 5 had been around and popular for about 5 or 6 years, and we were butting up into PHP 5.4 had been around for a while at this point, but we were on, we had 5.2 as our minimum required version, and we got to this terrible place where our code, we knew that we needed to embrace some of the more modern PHP conventions, like namespacing, which seems old hat now, but it was a really tough transition to make, and it invalidated all the old add-ons and all the old code, and really kind of led to a almost complete rewrite. For all intents and purposes, and getting to that, we knew something had to change, but that was a time of pretty great distress in that regard, because you've got the business aspect of Concrete 5. Franz is like, you're telling me all the add-ons are going to be invalidated? That's insane, and he's totally right. And then we've got developers who are saying, what do you mean I can't use the latest version of this library because we're on this really old end of life PHP version? That's insane, and they're totally both right. And that was a tough time to navigate, and I think it probably took the project back 2-3 years at least, and we pushed over that, and it's important to have done. But those were days where we really there were some definite disagreements in how to proceed.
So that's my second question, how did you manage those?
It was hard. I think at a certain point, there's a tipping point, just kind of like the book says. One day you just get enough of that feedback, and it just kind of shifts your thinking, and you realize, I like to tell this anecdote. I remember for years, Steve Jobs at Apple, people said, like, why don't you have video on iPods? And he's like, no one wants to watch video on a tiny screen. And at the time he was right, on these little iPods or whatever. And then like the next year, I think after many years of other players having this capability, and then the next year he's like talking about the new iPods, which weren't even the big screen like iPhones yet. They were just an iPod with video, and he was talking about how it's like, this is the most beautiful tiny video player on the market. It's like, last year you said that the whole idea and product market was garbage. It's like, one day your perception changes, and then you realize, well, it's not going to do any good to worry about all the time that's happened before. Now we've made the decision to move forward. It's time to move forward as quickly as possible. Yeah.
So how do you balance, I guess, as a company, having a software product and being unique? That's kind of unique, like the space. How do you kind of balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It puts us in a pretty good space, honestly. Before we had Concrete 5 open source, we were just kind of a web agency. And at that point, you're taking any job not literally any job that you can get, but you're always hunting work, and you're always looking for new clients. And that's not really different for us, but with such a big platform out there, we get to be pretty picky about who we choose to spend our time with, which is awesome. So it changes it positively in that regard. And then regarding how we sort of balance the two things, whenever we're doing client work, we've become really good at just kind of having these informal conversations about figuring out where the line between the custom work ends and the core work begins. So people don't always pay specifically to have the core changed, but we look at projects and say, you know, this is really interesting. I think this company wants the calendar events to be versioned. That's going to be something that everyone can benefit from. So let's spend a little extra time and do that versioning at the core level. And we just kind of, and we've gotten good about it. We've gotten good at sort of informally figuring that out without it being, it is not a tough thing for us to do. We kind of do it instinctively these days. We get to figure out how to make the changes to the core to move the core forward. And usually companies are totally happy with that. They understand. You know, for years, open source was kind of tough to sell companies on, and it's funny that I haven't really thought about it, but I haven't had that problem in a long time. Like companies in the web, at least, they get open source. They know that their customizations could be folded back, and most of the time they're only too happy to have that happen. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thank you guys.